I'd like to begin by discussing the interplay between theory, research, and policy in economics in the abstract. And quite broadly, given your experience, how ought economic research to inform economic policy? And while this might seem like a banal question, I think it's serious. And one reason I bring it up is that I've done a number of episodes on Marx, communism, and socialism, which are of immense historical interest. But so far as I can tell, many of the proposed policies that emerge from contemporary Marxist economists are not only dictated by theory at the expense of research, they're actually insensitive to both research and historical developments.
Look, I think that policy should be designed to achieve the best possible outcomes, and one's ability to influence the system successfully depends on an understanding of how that system operates and what is a way of understanding the way in which it evolves and how its evolution is altered by various kinds of interventions. And ultimately, that's what economic research does with respect to the economy. So if we have a better understanding of what happens when there are price controls, if we have a better understanding of what happens when banks are better capitalized rather than worse capitalized, with a better understanding of how differences in tax rates affect individual incentives to buy energy-intensive products or to work hard, those better understandings translate ultimately and in the long run into better policies. We have nothing to learn from except the past. And so better and keener understandings of history and the forces that have shaped it contribute to wiser policies that do more to avoid the mistakes of the past and do better in learning the lessons of the past. And so in those ways, I think of the broad enterprise of economic research as contributing over time to better outcomes, to both the design of different policies and to the better implementation of broad policy concepts that have been set. I am not somebody who believes that there's a useful exercise of forming the model. And then once one knows the model, putting different policies into the model and seeing which one will operate best. I don't think we have the capacity to develop models with that degree of precision or that degree of universality in recognizing all their impacts for that to be possible. So I never think that a consequential policy choice should follow from a single model or a single study by an economist. But I think the cumulative understanding that comes from economic research contributes very much to better policy.
So you said that policy should be designed for the best possible outcome, and then presumably somebody like you and Jerome Powell have a similar best possible outcome in mind. And since we don't, as you mentioned, have the capacity to produce models of sufficient sophistication to test cases out beforehand, but you two also presumably agree on the research, perhaps the underlying theory. How is it that you two might arrive at different conclusions? What other factors are at play here beyond just the research or the theory?
Well, I think there are two different set of issues that come in there. One set of issues involves different values. If policy A will lead the average level of incomes to be 3% higher, but will lead carbon emissions in the air to be 10% higher, and policy B will lead to lower carbon emissions and lower incomes and purchasing power for people, then it becomes a matter of values rather than a matter of purely analytical decision making. Of course, those kinds of considerations come in with respect to fairness. How should one think about a policy that adds $1 million to the income of people with incomes over $200,000 versus a policy that adds $10,000 to the income of people with incomes of $25,000. So there are questions of values that often drive disagreements, even if there's a relatively common view as to what the impacts are going to be. And then operating with the same body of evidence and looking at the same history, different people will come to different conclusions about what the impact of a given set of policies is likely to be. So a couple of years ago, I was strongly of the view that there were real risks that the very large stimulus proposals put in place, along with the zero interest rate policies being pursued, would generate substantial inflation. Others had the view, based on their reading of history, that that was much less likely, and that those stimulus policies were extremely unlikely to generate substantial inflation. So even if one has a broadly similar set of statistical tools, the data are not clear enough to permit definitive judgment as to which way to do forecasts are right. And I think both those elements enter into policy-making judgments.
Yeah, as an outsider to economics, when I view these disputes in the media, they often seem utterly intractable. And while I can understand that there's probably much more room for debate around the interpretation of data and history, when there's a dispute in values, it is much more difficult to adjudicate, and they're sort of irreconcilable. And that's a lot of what you see in the news cycle.
But I actually think a lot of the issues are actually not really issues of values, but are issues of assessing consequences. You know, some people believe that higher tariffs will lead to greater job creation, less job disruption, and no substantial adverse consequences for working people as a group. Others believe that higher tariffs mean higher prices, that for every job that is saved in an import competing industry, two are lost in an industry that otherwise would have had opportunities to export, but for higher priced components that they have to pay because of the restrictions on imports. And there's that disagreement. That's not really a disagreement about values. That's a disagreement about the consequences of the tariff policy. My judgment would be that there are many important disagreements that are actually disagreements about what the likely consequences of different policy actions are. Some people believe that if you raise tax rates, there will be a very substantial impact on work incentives. Other of us believe that people want to work, that people want to have high relative income, that if people feel poorer because they're paying more in taxes, they might actually work harder. And so tend to be skeptical of arguments that raising taxes will be very counterproductive because of the effect on incentives. That's a that's an empirical controversy more than it's a controversy about values.
In the absence of these sophisticated models, then since I know that you were interested in mathematics beforehand, and the gold standard for dispute among mathematicians is a proof from axioms, but you can't do that in economics because, as you mentioned, it is entirely empirical. So, how is it that you will adjudicate these disputes? Is it just who can come up with a better argument, or is it just going to be a brute fact of who's in power, who gets to test their theory?
Ultimately, in democratic societies, these decisions are rarely left to experts. These decisions are ultimately placed in the hands of non-experts who elections or are appointed by those who won elections, and it falls to them to balance competing expert opinions as best they can and to make the best judgments. And I don't think there's a better way of doing it than that. As your question suggested, I don't think the model of mathematical proof is helpful in thinking about the policy process.